Good morning and welcome to this panel on the political economy of Marx. Marx's method, his analytical framework, has been a tremendously powerful way of comprehending capitalist dynamics, the capitalist economy, and it has proved supple enough to understand the complexities of contemporary capitalism more than a century and a half after he wrote. Marx had warned that there's no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep summits have the chance of gaining its luminous summits. And I'm very pleased to have panelists who have not dreaded that fatiguing climb and who have in different ways engaged creatively with Marx's work and used it to understand today's world and critique and understand. I'm Ramaa Vasudevan from Colorado State University, and the speakers in order are going to be Carolina Alves, Associate Professor of Economics at Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose, University College of London, specializes in macroeconomics, political economy, development, and Marxian economics, and philosophy of economics. Deepankar Basu, Professor of Economics at UMass Amherst, with interest in classical political economy, macroeconomics, development economics, and econometrics. Nikolaos Chatzarakis from the New School for Social Research, who focuses on economic growth and Marxian perspectives. Riccardo Bellofiore, Professor of Political Economy at University of Bergamo, with research areas of Marxist theory of value and crisis, endogenous theories of money, and history of political economy and economic philosophy. So with no further ado, I hand it over to our panelists, and may they climb the fatiguing paths. So, Carolina.
Your slides. I'm going to talk about your slides. So, is the okay? Is everyone listening to me? Yeah. So, okay, good. Okay. So, thank you, everyone, for being here today, and also thank you this lovely panel that I'm part of. I'm really proud to be part of this panel, but also thank you to Clara, Tissue, Scott, and Bruno, not only for organizing this conference, but also for putting the center together, the Center of Heterodox Economics. I've been battling for us to embrace this term together with Ingrid, I don't know where she's, oh, here you go, in the UK for over 6 years to ask economists, or alternative economists, to embrace these terms, and this term, and the resistance is unbelievable. So this center, coming up now in such a difficult historical moment, run by such brilliant economists, is fresh and exciting thing, so I'm really happy to be here. And even more exciting because it's not holding back, placing economics where it should be, meaning that economists should always be capable of feeling deeply any injustice committed against anyone, anywhere in the world. So all power and good luck to you four. Thank you very much. So yeah, so my talk is under this umbrella of political economy of Karl Marx. I didn't have slides, but Riccardo told me off yesterday, so I made something up today. I've been trying to not use PowerPoint, but it's hard. So what I'm trying to do in 15 minutes, I hope I have 13, okay, is to explain how I use Marxian economics in my approach in 3 broad umbrellas: macroeconomics, value, and finance. And then I hope from there we can then discuss deeper into some of these themes and concepts that these 3 areas is stimulate us to engage in some of this discussion. So the first one I'm calling like macroeconomics, which is a discipline basically. And but what I want to highlight here is the structuralist macroeconomics. And structuralism here is when structuralism emphasizes the influence of social and environment factors on individuals' behavior, and then examine how this behavior in turn will impact the system of the economy. And it sounds a bit obvious, but in macroeconomics is exactly the opposite what is done. So in macroeconomics, you have the analysis coming from the individual to the macro. So it's a massive deal to do the inverse, and not just the inverse, but doing both, right? So what in macroeconomics, we have the what we call the macro foundations and the micro foundations. And what I'm saying here is kind of challenge that a little bit, and you can come back to this later. But what I'm interested within this structuralist macroeconomics is something that has been put forward by economists such as Celso Furtado a long time ago, but also more recent, another group of Brazilian economists, Mício, Jaime Loureiro, where the argument is that in structuralist macroeconomics, actually, you have this confrontation within a given reality of whatever is the categories you define in this abstract analysis. So it's very interesting because, again, you need to have this kind of match between what's happening in reality and the categories you're trying to use. And here I'm quoting some, what is in the paper of Mício, James, and Loureiro, when they say it's not enough to construct abstract model and craft an explanation of these inner workings. Equally important is the verification of the explanatory efficacy of such analysis. So this takes me to this paper, where I'm trying to do this, right? Trying to see how we can bring Marx and macroeconomics together. That's not me, that was Joan Robinson. I'm just following her steps. She has mentioned, her name was mentioned here before. So what I'm trying to do, and this paper is supposed to be much more analytical than historical, but during the pressures of publications, it became historical, so I could publish in a journal that would guarantee me a job later on. So this paper, trying to go back to this attempt of building this bridge between Marxian economics and macro with this sense of reality, this sense of how to grasp reality, right? And what I want to do, or at least to do for this historical moment, what was John Robinson did in 1942, was to show how Marxian economics can grasp reality much more than the orthodoxy at the time. And, we can go... So we can go on and on in terms of what is in this paper, but one thing that really got my attention, for example, let me just see something. I think I just had the wrong PowerPoint here, but anyway. So, for example, one criticism we have in this paper is how John Robinson is saying that orthodoxy see the profit as falling out of nowhere. There's no explanation of profit, right? And in that you see even today, so profit is basically what at the time is equal to the supply price of capital. And this profit is basically the rewarding of risk-bearing plus the interest that is rewarded for waiting. And John Robinson was saying, what is that? How can you understand that? And reading Marx, especially the scheme of expanded production, is very clear to her that capitalists engage in production to make profit. I know that sounds very obvious, but for someone trained in a very mainstream setting, I would say even today, but also at the time, this was like something that was quite a surprise for her. And she also highlights something that you didn't have in orthodoxy, what she calls the most striking difference between Marx and orthodox economics, which is the concept of surplus value. And another thing she highlights is how in Marx there is this rate of exploitation. The exploitation is a matter of fact. And then she started trying to engage that, or at least compare that with how macroeconomists at the time understand the word. And my table is not there, but you can, I'm going to do the very pedantic thing that academics usually do. You can read the paper. So there is the table there where you can see this comparison. And that's something I want to try to do for now. And is engagement directly with the macroeconomics discipline and so on. So the other part of how I use Marx in my discipline, in my journey, is the question of value. So in here, what I did was to go back to Marx's 1847 book, The Misery of Philosophy, to try to understand value within capitalism, right? So in this book, what we have there is a very initial design of Marx's labor theory of value, although a very already strong criticism towards the theory of value as elaborated by the classical economists. Now, the discussion of labor labor theory of value and its validity has been done by so many scholars. That's not what I'm doing, and it's a vast literature. What I want to do in this book is to go to a different part of this argument, which perhaps even comes before that discussion of the validity of the labor theory of value now and how we measure and so on. So what I'm trying to do is to show that the need of a theory value, a labor theory of value, followed the economic and social and political transformations that consolidated a very specific mode of production, where both the relationship between people and their means of production and also the objectives of productions were radically changed. So this, basically what I'm saying here, is the emergence of private property, as we know today, and the production with the objective of accumulating wealth. And that true change is kind of demand or required the definition of value of a commodity. So I'm trying to make the argument that the first association between value and labor, and that's not just me that's doing, but I want to bring that back. So the first association between value and labor, as well the first theories about the labor theory of value, is following capitalism, is linked to the development of capitalism. So if you go back to the 17th century, for example, when you can see the first theorization about labor and value together, which, by the way, goes back to John Locke, which wasn't like, when he was theorizing about the natural law, you can see the labor, the link between labor and value being designed. And then, of course, after that is a long way through political economic thinking, trying to understand how that happens. Now, what I get from this from Marx, that coincidence, some authors call it coincidence, can be explained by two reasons. The first is the moment where you have these ways of production, it changes, the ways of production change, and the conception and the meaning of labor also changed. And the second aspect is the way of producing, aiming at accumulating wealth, was taking place through the exploitation of labor, or more precisely, the exploitation of free labor. So, therefore, measuring the amount of labor in a commodity became an essential condition to understand how accumulation of wealth was happening. So I believe that this part of the discussion is crucial to challenge both the definition of value as utility, which is what we have in mainstream economics, but also in sociological circles, the idea that these transformations we have in labor relations have kind of questioned the role of labor in understanding and structuring the reality. So my research aims to enter this debate through a path other than questioning the new source of value or analyzing the labor process, or even if there is a new way that capital found to exploit its labor. But my aim is to try to present and explain the idea that the association between labor and value is characteristic of capitalism, right? And if you're still under capitalism, these objectives, this kind of characteristic would still be there. And the association between labor and value would become even stronger. So, yeah, I have one, he was here. I know it was somewhere. So anyway, spoke that. And that is the table that I told you guys you can see in a painting when they're trying to compare. Anyway. It's all messed up, sorry. But the last point I would talk about, and I'm not going to have much time to do this, so I'm just going to leave to the discussion, is how I use Marx to understand finance, and particularly the concept of fictitious capital to understand financialization. But I don't want to rush, so I'm going to leave it there, and we can talk about that in a discussion. Should I go? Wow, okay, great. So 1 minute, gosh. So, okay, so I'm trying to explain that in 1 minute. So basically what I'm doing here, and I have to be very careful because we have, where is David? McNally is there. And then we have Costas somewhere, who are scholars that has really influenced my work. So it's hard to say what I'm doing in front of them. But yeah, so what I'm trying to explain, this concept of financialization, to me, relies to, the way to explain that within the Marxist framework is this expansion of fictitious capital. And fictitious capital here is nothing else than financial assets, tradable financial assets, and you can go back to there. But within the Marxist literature, what that means is that we start having very thorny discussion regarding this difference between fictitious capital and interest-bearing capital. So interest-bearing capital being the capital that actually generates surplus value. So what I'm trying to do here, and now I hope I have that slide, is that what fictitious capital does. So the tendency of capitalism to basically skip the production process where exploit labor, so this perception of M prime, of money, generate more money, which is the tendency which is behind this financialization. I see that as the expansion of fictitious capital, which basically what does to this circuit of industrial capital is saying instead of M prime, we have M and then M prime minus M double prime. So this double prime is basically what we have representing returns on tradable financial assets contract. And that doesn't mean a massive deal, but within Marxism it is, because what I'm saying, this will impact the way profit is distributed and so on. And I have an explanation for that, although we need to do the empirical work. So, if there is anyone who wants to do a PhD with me, I'm open. So yeah, we can go to the discussion about that. But thank you very much.
Deepankar Basu.
This one, right? Doesn't seem to be working. Okay. So I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be involved in the inaugural conference of the Center for Heterodox Economics. From yesterday's session, we learned that there are at least 3 areas for work that heterodox economists must be involved in. 1, develop, deepen, strengthen non-mainstream economic traditions and work in theory, empirics, and policy. 2nd, develop critiques of the mainstream. And 3rd, very importantly, learn from and address issues emerging from people's struggles and challenge key silences that is there in the mainstream. So what I want to talk about today really falls in the first area. So I would like to present some work on key ideas in Marxian economics, which has been studied for a long time. So I would like to talk about 3 key issues. One falls under what I consider microeconomic theory from Marx, which is the theory of labor theory of value and its relationship to prices. So there is a long tradition which has understood or tried to understand the relationship between prices, which we observe, and labor values, which we don't observe, and are they close? So I want to talk about that. The other 2 issues I want to talk about fall broadly under what I would say is the macroeconomic structure and dynamics of capitalist economies. So the first one is a very long debate about the impact of technical change on profitability. The question is, does technical change of a certain kind lead to a tendency for the rate of profit to fall? And finally, I'll talk about the second question in macro is a long-run question, and the third question is a short-run question about fluctuations. So capitalist economies don't grow in a steady manner, there is fluctuations, and Marx had a very good theory about that. I would like to show you some empirical evidence for that theory. Okay, so let me go to the first question. So in the classical tradition, prices which we observe are understood as being regulated by labor values which we don't observe, and labor values are really the direct and indirect labor necessary to produce a commodity which is sold in the market. Now there are at least two different ways to understand this concept of regulation. One we can trace back to Marx, where prices emerge when the labor value produced in different sectors are redistributed because capital moves between sectors so as to equalize the rate of profit. Now, one very important conclusion from this theory, according to my interpretation, is that there is no need for labor values and prices to be close. There is an alternative interpretation which goes back to Riccardo, who would argue that labor values regulate prices in the sense that labor values are centers of gravitation around which prices fluctuate, and a key conclusion would follow that labor values and prices are close to each other. So there is a long tradition inaugurated by the pioneering work of Anwar, who is here, which has studied this and has presented evidence that labor values and prices are close. So in joint work with a graduate student at UMass, Tanos Moraitis, we have revisited this work. So we have tried to estimate three things: direct prices, which are just a multiple of labor values; prices of production, which are the prices which arise when profit rates are equalized across sectors; and market prices, which we observe. So we did this for a large number of countries, 555 country years, and we also did this for the US with more granular data for 5 years. And let me directly go to what I find, because I can come back to the details during the Q&A. So what we find is that there is no robust evidence for prices to be close to labor values. So that's the broad conclusion we find. That goes against much of this literature, and we are trying to understand why we find that they are not close, but the other literature finds that it is close, and we can talk about that. But what is important for me is to highlight the conclusion. So what we find evidence against is Riccardo's interpretation of the relationship of price and value. It is not an evidence against Marx's interpretation, because Marx's interpretation treats the labor theory of value as holding in the aggregate. So the labor theory of value, according to Marx, is that the total bundle of newly produced commodities valued in labor terms and in price terms are equal, which opens the possibility that individual prices and values can deviate, and if there is a lot of redistribution of surplus values across sectors, then we would not expect prices to be close to labor values. So that's the first issue that I would like to present. It is a little controversial because it goes against a very distinguished and long literature. The second issue also is a very intervention in a very long debate, and here the main issue is the following. So in volume 3, Marx argued that there is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall as capitalist economies develop. And in 1960s, a Japanese economist kind of provided an argument which sought to overthrow Marx's analysis and argument. And his basic idea was that capitalist firms will adopt new techniques of production only if they are expected to increase the rate of profit. And if all capitalists do that, then the average rate of profit will actually rise rather than fall. So there is a large literature which has tried to see whether Marx's conclusions are right or this Japanese economist Okishio's conclusion is right. My take from this very long and distinguished literature is that it really depends on what happens to the real wage rate. So it's a simple idea. If the real wage rate grows and it grows fast enough, then the surplus value that has been created in production is partly taken away by labor, and that creates the possibility for the rate of profit to fall. So what we can identify, and in previous work I have identified what we can call the Marx-Occhio threshold for the rate of growth of the real wage rate. If the real wage rate goes faster than this threshold, then the rate of profit will fall. If it does not, then it will not fall, it will rise. So the key question seems to be to identify what happens to the real wage rate. And the previous literature has not done that. So in a recent working paper, I embed this question in a broader macroeconomic framework where the real wage rate is also determined along with other variables. And I look at three different contexts. One, an advanced capitalist economy where labor is strong, and the corresponding real-world example would be the post-war period for the 25-year period from 48 to mid-70s. Another advanced capitalist economy with weak labor, which is the post-80s US economy. And another is the labor surplus economy, a developing economy like Brazil, India. And what I find is that once you embed this question in the macro model, then the rate of profit can only fall when we are in an advanced capitalist economy with strong labor. So the key idea I take from this is that the structure of the labor market and the power of labor vis-a-vis capital is key to understanding this question, and we cannot address this question without taking this into account. And what I find very interesting is that I found an article of Maurice Dobb in 1945 where he made the same argument. So I was happy that other more distinguished scholars have thought about the same thing. And I can show you some evidence. So this is the rate of profit calculated in different ways for 1948 to 80. So this is the advanced capitalist economy with strong labor. And all the rate of profits have a tendency to fall. The same when I do for the next period, 1980 to 2020, for the US economy, there is a tendency for the rate of profit to rise. One important implication is that the crisis that started in 2008 was not a falling rate of profit crisis. Rate of profit was rising, and this theory would tell us that we have to look at other factors also. The rate of profit is important, but it is not the only factor. Marx has a much broader theory of crisis. Okay, the last thing I would like to talk about is this fluctuation. So capitalist economies continuously fluctuate, and Marx offered a very good theory in volume 1 of Capital, and then Richard Goodwin formalized that model. The key idea is that there is an interaction between the distribution of income between labor and capital, the wage share, and the reserve army of labor, which we can capture by the employment rate. So just to take you through the cycle, when there is rapid capital accumulation, it can lead to the depletion of the reserve army of labor, which can increase the power of labor, which can then get higher wages, and then the wage share rises. That can lead to the rate of profit falling, and the capitalists can then reduce the capital accumulation rate, which then increases the reserve army of labor, weakens the labor power, bargaining power of labor, and leads to higher profits and revives the cycle. So this is a very intuitive explanation of cycles that we observe. There has not been a lot of work on testing this theory, so along with another UMass graduate student, Diego Martins, we've looked to evidence for this in 15 advanced capitalist countries, OECD countries. So the key thing that we bring, so there are two papers which have done empirical work. That the key innovation that we are making is that we want to say that this is a theory of the business cycle. So we cannot look at longer periods. Earlier papers have looked at 30 years, 40-year periods. But there, the business cycle fluctuation gets washed out across many business cycles. So what we do is we collect data for each individual business cycle. And since we want some large number of periods, we look at quarterly data. So our sample has 54 business cycles in the post-war period, We are trying to expand the data set even further. And what we do is we test whether the Goodwin cycle, which is really a theorization of Marx's idea, is close to reality. What we do is for every business cycle, we look at the average value of the employment rate, which is a proxy for the reserve army of labor, and an average value of the wage share, which is a proxy for the power of labor. And we see if the predicted value and the actual value are close to each other. And we do it for these 54 business cycles. So let me go to the results, because I don't have a lot of time. What we find is, for a vast number of cycles, so 40 out of 54 cycles, what is predicted by the model is close to what is actually observed. There is a much closer correspondence in the employment rate than in the wage share. And why is that so? Because of the way wage share is measured, which leaves out the self-employed, and therefore underestimates the wage share, and that leads to the discrepancy. So if we are better able to measure wage share, I think we will get much better correspondence not only in the employment rate and the direction of the cycle, but also in the predicted wage share. Thank you.
Okay, hello from me as well, and thank you for organizing this. I think it's one of the best initiatives we've seen in the last years, and should all, I don't know, people tend to pray these days for some reason. We should fight instead of praying for this initiative to keep going. We need much more discussions like this. We need much more connection to the communities. I kind of fall short on the second part. I think in the line of all the speakers so far, I'm likely going to be on the first side where we are, evaluating theories rather than doing anything else. And you will also forgive me. I'm kind of unscripted, unedited, unrehearsed, dots. My idea for today was to go back to talk about a not so controversial issue in Marx as value theory, falling rate of profit, etc., which I actually would like to talk very much about, but I thought of talking about something else because I think we can go a bit deeper in some of those, easy ideas. We all write the MC, M prime formula and say, okay, that's the way capitalism works, but what's actually happening there may matter, and may also matter in terms of us being able of identifying in which phase of accumulation in capitalism we are, in which kind of crisis we are, and so on. So that's the kind of work I'll try to do. As you see, the slides are so many, I won't talk about all of them. I'll be mainly waving my hands. So Marx, of course, and that's something quite interesting, is not the first to have spoken about that. It's something that goes all the way back to the 18th century, and that's something that we should sometimes, keep in the back of our minds, in the sense that, and then I'll paraphrase Branko Milanovic here, we are not heterodox, we're actually orthodox. We are a continuation of the orthodox, they are something else. So I won't really talk about the history of it. It goes all the way back to François Quesnay and the tableau économique, and how we can understand the economy as a circular flow of commodities, money, etc. And this is something that is so powerful that it goes latently into all economists. Smith doesn't really talk about it. I think the reason is that he liked Quesnay. He liked what Quesnay had done. He pretty much agreed with it. And the idea is so strong that it reappears again and again. We see it in Keynes, we see it in the MMT, we see it in the French circulationist school, all of this. So this is something strong, and Marx devoted almost an entire volume of Capital talking about that. So what's the story here? Oh, I'll kind of skip this for the moment being. The idea is pretty simple. It starts in the very first volume. We have this point, what's the seller, what's the buyer, doing, they are exchanging commodities for money. So there's a simple formula that can describe everything. When the seller has a commodity, exchanges that for money, and then takes another commodity, and the buyer has the money, buys the commodity, and then sells it to someone else to get the money back. And obviously this thing tells us nothing, really nothing, because if we were to go on circles like this, we would be doing nothing. It would be an economy that doesn't grow, an economy that doesn't have profit, nothing. So Marx says the whole point in even simple commodity production is that in the end of one such circle, you have profit. And I guess everyone knows that. I'm saying nothing here. When someone who has money advances this money to get commodity and then sells them back, this someone hopes to do it for profit. How many ways there are to get profit in such a cycle? Essentially two, if you round them all up. One of them is moving assets around from one place to another. You could call that theft, actually. You could call it profiting without producing. You could call it a lot of things. Or you can say that in this circuit there's a break somewhere, and in this break there is a kind of production. How was it called yesterday? We go from low entropy to high entropy. You could call it this way. And this allows for, and pardon my Anglicanism, a transubstantiation of commodities into something else. And this something else is that I start with a commodity, I go through a circle of low entropy, high entropy again, and come up with a different bundle of commodities. So Marx, at the end of the day, gives us this much more complicated formula, which starts with the money, someone advancing this money. We call that someone capitalist, firm, entrepreneur, whatever you want. This someone advances the money, buys commodities, particular types of commodities. One of them is labor power, the other one is means of production, puts them together. There's a break in that circulation where you have production, the P. This P creates a new set of commodities, C prime, which the capitalist hopes to sell for more money. And that's the story. The story is very simple so far. There's no debt, there's no credit, there's no external means of financing or external means of appropriating things. It's very simple. Imagine like a closed economy, 19th century capitalism. I know this is a deficiency, but I'll keep it to this level of simplicity just for the sake of the argument. And of course, this is, if you want, this is what happens from the standpoint of a capitalist that has money on their hands and advances them in order, in the end of the day, to get more money. But you could also see it from the standpoint of someone who sits in the factory or in the whatever else workplace, and they actually don't see a circuit of money flowing. They see a circuit of breaks between a production period and another production period. Marx also talked about that. He called it the circulation of the means of production and labor power as capital, while the previous one could be called the circulation of money as capital. In this case, what actually happens is that we start with a phase of production. We start with a combination of means of production with labor power. They produce commodities. These commodities are sold for money, and this money hopefully will be reinvested, at least some of them, in order to get these new commodities that we need, labor power and means of production again, to go back into production. And this is exactly the standpoint of a factory, right? And of course, depending on what kind of reinvestment we have, and all this again is volume 2, and someone should in principle remember them, is that depending on, what amount of money is being reinvested, you can think of yourself being in a simple reproduction case where all the profit that was made during that circle goes directly to the capitalist pockets and is being consumed, hoarded, whatever else is dropped out of this production circuit, and the only money that returns back to it is equal to the original sum that was advanced. Or you can imagine them reinvesting those profits, so expanding their production structure, buying more means of production and more labor power in certain proportions, or even breaking these proportions, bringing in technological change essentially to make the production process larger than the previous period. And of course you can imagine all intermediate cases, and you can even imagine cases that are not so normal where someone would even decrease the amount of money that they reinvest. Anyway, and of course we have the third case, which is we have spoken about the circulation of money as capital, so from the standpoint of the person who advances those money in order to get back more money. We talked about the circulation of means of production and labor power as capital, so the circulation of those breaks, the production process breaks, and of course we can talk about the circulation of commodities as capital, essentially a merchant who has commodities that has to sell for money in order to give this money back to production and get the new commodities that they will sell. And all these are nice and interesting, and we should all in principle know it. What's the point here is that in each of these circles that the one is interfaced in the other, and they go hand in hand and they repeat again and again, and it's like a network actually, it's not a circle, it's like repeating circles all around us. All commodities, all money go around in such circles. Every time that we move from M to C, from C to P, from P to C prime, from C prime to M prime, and then back, in every of these possible changes, we have a possible break. And Marx is quite explicit about that. Every time that money has to be converted to commodities and commodities have to be converted to money, there is a possibility that something will go wrong. And of course, what's that? The initiation of a crisis. And what I came to think is that we can start classifying different types of crises, the falling rate of crisis, the disproportion crisis, the underconsumption crisis, the liquidity lack crisis, realization, financialization, all of these types of crises in a very simple, you could call it model, that would follow this idea. And if you dig a bit deeper into it, you'll see that even in Marx, and I'm following Nito's classification drawn from Marx, there is already some prototype classification of a type 1, type 2 crisis, where depending on whether you have excess capital or excess commodity, and you can go even further. By the way, excess capital in this context essentially is a facade for the overaccumulation crisis, the falling rate of profit crisis, according to some people, while the type 2 or excess commodities are essentially the disproportions and realization crisis. You can go even further and say there's an even type 3, which is excess money, and which is what today you could call financialization or liquidity lack or whatever of the sort. So can we do something to bring this all together? Maybe. And that's where Foley comes in, and the things I skipped in the beginning. I won't talk about the math, sorry for showing it. It's just that someone like 30, 40 years ago sat down and did the math for us. That was Duncan Foley. He wrote down the flow of value of finished commodities, the flow of value of finished commodities at cost at the market, after the trading, perfect. And then how this goes back to recover the expended capital outlays, and then there's a realized surplus value part and how that is reinvested, yada, yada, yada. And I'll skip all that. And of course, if you take all these production lags that introduced, all these variables that you introduce, you can write down the change in the stock of the aggregate productive capital, the aggregate commercial capital, the aggregate money capital, which are these three equations for anyone who might be interested. And I kind of say, and of course, if you add them up, you have the total capital of the society, and you can calculate the rate of profit, etc., etc., etc. And one could, in principle, try to reformulate that, because I found the model too long and complicating. And I said, okay, what you have is actually three variables, which when they sum up, they're equal to the surplus value that is being reinvested plus the stock flow differences. What happens if I reorganize that? I won't show the math. Essentially, you can define three variables, x, y, and z, which are nothing more but the changes of the productive, commercial, and money capital divided by the total investment. And the nice thing is that these three variables, when they sum up, they should give 1, because we have it's the total capital that has been reinvested. You can write down equations of evolution for these variables. You can, sorry, I skip all of this. You can compute the so-called fixed points of that system, which are the points where the evolution stops. And the first one is an interesting one. It's where you have absolute accumulation of productive capital, no accumulation of the other three. The second one is when you have an absolute accumulation of commercial capital and zero accumulation for the others. And the third one is when you have an absolute accumulation of money capital and zero accumulation for the others. And there is the possibility of a third one right in the middle of these three, where you have a kind of coexistence of them all. And the point is, this is how it should look if I have the, apologies of the chair for a minute. There's a problem here. The arrows should be the other way around. I'll have to fix that at some point. It's just playing around with my figures. I forgot to do it. What happens is that all the evolution actually falls into the simplex. where in the three vertices you can see the three fixed points. Oh dear, can I have 2 seconds? Good. When the three vertices you can see the three different over-accumulation points for over-accumulation of productive capital, over-accumulation of commodities, of commercial capital, and over-accumulation of money capital, or excess commodities, excess money, etc. The type 1, type 2, type 3 crisis, essentially. And the edges, as you go from the one to the other, again, remember that the arrow should be the other one, the other way around, are exactly the three types of crises as you move from over-accumulating one type of capital to over-accumulating another. And I'll stop here, just hoping that this may help us clarify a few things in the classification of crisis. Thank you very much. Should I close this?
How to view
Now you want me?
yes, I want to. No, okay, perfect,
Is it
perfect,
okay?
perfect. It's okay. Yes, 15 minutes, it's not very much. 30 minutes, okay, that's good. But I'll try to stay on the 15.
No, not 30. 13. 1-3.
Okay, but the point is it's flexible to 15, and I have 1 minute's bonus. Okay, I'm joking. You can say much in 13 minutes, so I decided to say nothing about everything. In studying about economic theory from an heterodox point of view, you have to unlearn what you have learned. And you have to realize that there is no royal road to science. It implies fatigue and work. And the point is not realism, it is abstraction. The point is to have the good abstraction. The first of the 11 theses, I will stop wherever I am. I think it is essential to distinguish 3 moments about Marx. Reading Marx, interpreting Marx, reconstructing Marx. Reading Marx is an appraisal of Marx in which you realize that Marx contradicts Marx. Interpretation is the attempt to develop what you think is the inner logic of Marx, so to read Marx according to Marx. The third way is reconstruction. It is the one I prefer since late 70s, actually, realizing that neither reading nor interpretation dissolve the difficulties in Marx. So to reconstruct, you have to enter in a dialogue with political economy of today, of the 20th century, and you have to deal with the changes in Marx. If you want to go beyond Marx with Marx, this means that you have to be bold enough to go against Marx. The second thesis, on which I will not say much, is that Marx is Hegelian, truly Hegelian, to be eventually anti-Hegelian. His theory is a critique of political economy. We should understand what political economy is. There is vulgar political economy, which is economics. Economics should be banned as a term. The mainstreams, there are many mainstreams, the Varrajan, the non-Varrajan, etc. It is a superficial look at reality, how reality seems. Political economy is a science, and nowadays is Keynesian, Sraffian, institutional, how capital produces. Critical political economy leading to critique of political economy wants to understand also how capital is produced. Just a point about Hegel. For Marx, there is an homology, especially at the beginning of volume 1. Capital is or pretends to be the absolute subject, exactly like Hegel's absolute spirit. So it is like God. We see this pretension every day. Third thesis. Marx is a monetary labor theory of value. The expression monetary value theory is common today. There was a guy in 1988 who wrote about a monetary labor theory of value, and labor must be there. That guy, by chance, is me. Those who go towards monetary value theory tends to skip labor. The story is very simple. There is, for Marx, an intrinsic value, that is the abstract labor contained within the single commodity, hidden within the use body, the use value of the commodity itself. This is a ghost. This ghost must take possession of another body, the body of money as a commodity. So gold as money is value embodied. You always listen about labor embodied. It does not exist in Marx. Value embodied exists. And the concrete labor producing gold as money is the only social labor. It should become that nice thing which is a butterfly and value producing more value, money producing more value, more money, but it can do that only when it becomes a vampire, sucking living labor from workers. In this argument, the link between value labor goes through money. The point is that money is a commodity, so if you don't believe that money is a commodity, there is a problem here. Somebody may ask, but is this a Gothic novel? The answer is yes, it is a Gothic novel. So before going to the slide, go to the fourth thesis. The fourth thesis is that the social power of value, money, capital is real. It is not just the power of workers or citizens stolen and going everywhere. The fetish has real powers. Things truly have effective social power. What is fetishism? It's a completely different thing. It's the naturalization of those social powers, believing that they spring from things themselves. So the fetish has social powers only in given historical circumstances. Fifth thesis. Capitalist production is nothing but consumption of living labor power, lebendige Arbeitskraft. You know labor power, you know living labor. I am talking of living labor power. What is living labor power? The human beings regarded just as bearers of capacity to work. And they are the workers who actually work. So capitalist production actually is nothing but consumption of workers. This is exploitation, use of workers. This cannot never be taken for granted. And this is the ground of the so-called labor theory of value. This is the foundation of the famous equality in the new transformation, MVA equal MDL, direct labor. This has been seen by very, very, very few. One is Massimiliano Tomba, who teaches at the University of Santa Cruz. Another is Piero Sraffa in 1940, even though not many knows that. You know, I'm Italian, so that's also publicity for our unfortunate country. A couple of others, and we stop there, are Chris Arthur and Etienne Balibar. Sixth thesis. In Marx, competition is a dual notion, a Janus-faced notion. There is a Ricardian side and a Schumpeterian side. Schumpeterian knew perfectly that he was plagiarizing Marx. Ricardian is the tendency to equal rate of profit between industries. Schumpeterian competition is the tendency to differentiate the rate of profit within industry through innovation. If you stress the former, you end up Ricardian, even though you think you are Marxist. And in my view, those who stress the notion of long period method in Marx end up being Ricardian. I would be in favor of rebalancing very much towards the Schumpeterian notion. I have no time to go into that, but if you take the fifth and sixth thesis, the transformation problem does not exist anymore. There is a transformation, but there is no problem. Seventh, and this was, of course, Schumpeter. Seventh thesis, appropriately enough, is on the seventh section. Marx is a macro-social monetary theorist. If you think of Mosley, Mosley has not this kind of macro-social monetary theory. That macro-social monetary theory, on which I can't stay there, sees capitalism as a monetary sequence in successive steps, and it should be developed, reconstructed in terms of initial finance to production that antevalidates labor as money in motion. In my view, this resolves the problem of the monetary labor theory of value. Who were the theorists of this view? Wicksell, Schumpeter, Keynes Treatise on Money, Dennis Robertson. If you go along this way, you realize that in Marx, but Luxemburg saw this perfectly well, autonomous demands drives production. This is the view by Luxemburg, Kaleski, John Robinson, partially of Keynes' general theory. So makes no mistake, investment comes before savings. So investment is necessary, the investment demand, to have surplus value, not the other way around. 8th thesis, very quickly, realization crisis. I just say that Rosa Luxemburg had a realization crisis view which was not under consumptionist. It was under investment. And the one who saw this was John Robinson. Then what about the tendential fall in the rate of profit? I think that this is the 9th thesis. It cannot be accepted in its classical version. Why? Because most of the time, say all the 20th century, counter tendencies win. But in reconstruction, this is not Marx, this is reconstruction, you should base your argument on the tendential fall in the rate of profit as a meta-theory of crisis. That is a theory that encompasses all other crises. So the long depression of the end of the 19th century was the classical tendential rate of profit fall, an excess capital, if you wish. The great crash was a realization crisis. The great stagflation of the 60s and 70s was a profit squeeze, but not of the Ricardian kind, but in production. The great financial crisis, what was? A new kind of crisis based in finance. You have to go to Minsky, but also Adam Tooze. The 10th, I can say nothing because it is on neoliberalism. I just say that neoliberalism is not what you think it is. It is an active, policy-driven, non-stagnationist capitalist configuration based on a very active monetary policy. I call this configuration the real subsumption of labor to finance. It has been called privatized Keynesianism, number 1. Now we are living privatized Keynesianism, number 2, where there is the return of government deficits and active fiscal policies coherent with precarious jobs. Probably Clara Mattei would call this austeritarianism. This view must be linked to what I said about the fact that capitalism is not just low wages, it's not just all that. Let me go to the 11th thesis. The 11th thesis, my 11th thesis, is the second thesis of Marx on Feuerbach, where he says that the opposition between theory and reality is wrong, is a scholastic view. You need to stress practice. If you think that practice is the same thing as praxis in Gramsci, you are wrong. They are completely different categories, but I can't go into that. This is the last slide, if I can. Gramsci is relevant, I think, for the center of heterodox economics, for these phrases in the first issue of L'Ordine Nuovo, May 1919. He says to the young people, educate yourself because we will need all your intelligence. Mobilize yourself because we will need all your enthusiasm. Get organized because we will need all your strength. I apologize, I'm old. I don't understand the word activism. I understand the word militant. And of course, theory must be related to militancy. But here, in a place like this, the point is education, which goes into mobilization, organization, and goes back. If you risk the substitution of the second and third with the one, you are in a bad place.
What a wonderful beginning to the morning. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So we got a flavor here and a breadth of, Marx's method and how you can begin with value and commodity and then build up to a theory of the circuit of capital, reproduction of capital, the breaks, the cycles, the crisis, and how you can move from money, build up to not just finance, but also think fictitious capital and the role of public debt and bringing in the state. And it is this powerful method where your object of analysis is the capitalist economy, but you begin with this abstraction, drill it down to the simplest, elements, and then reconstruct this chaotic conception in your head as a totality through successive approximations, adding the layers. I think Sweezy had this metaphor about peeling the onion and crying a lot while doing that. But, and we actually see, and there's no artificial division between micro and macro, because when you do value, you're doing it in the aggregate. There's no distinction between, finance and the real sector, because as soon as you start with exchange, you have commodities and you have money. And when you have the circuit, you have finance and you have all the real components. And I think the speakers in their own inimitable styles and ways have brought this range. And what I would like in the second round is everyone, respond to each other, and we'll have about 2 minutes each, Clara? Okay. And also talk a little more about, today's world and where we can take this method today. So.
I go last, so I understand.
Today's whoever wants. Okay, you can go in the order you began, or let's go to the reverse order. Perfect.
No, but repeat the last question because I forgot it. I didn't get it.
Basically, comment on the relevance of the method and approach today. Yes.
I thought it was pretty obvious, but I can go. I can go into that. Let me start from the crisis of neoliberalism. Oh, no, let me start from my formation. I was lucky enough, like Minsky, to have forecast 5 of the last 2 great crises. Actually, I lived these 2 crises. One was when I studied. I began studying these kind of things early 70s, and the other one, actually we are in the 3rd crisis, but the other one was the so-called 2008 crisis. Everybody calls that way, but it is the 2007 crisis. Otherwise, I would not understand how I, with Joseph Alevi, was able to write about that crisis in 2007. So the crisis of the 70s for me was many things, but was anchored in what I call profit squeeze from struggles in immediate labor process. Workers were able to resist the needed capital increase of surplus value. The one of today is the crisis, so-called of financialization, but it is a crisis, in my view, of finance. When I studied, I was convinced that Marx could have been the answer to everything. My reading of Marx was very much due to workers at Fiat with whom I did political activity.
at the time in il gruppo, il manifesto. They were all males. If I would have lived in Novara, probably many of them would have been females, because one thing was the textile, one thing was the metal workers. Theoretically and practically, we were defeated, not just because the other were strong and bastard, but because there were limits in theory and there were limits in political practice. In political practice, there were very good signs of where to go, but not enough. In political practice, the crisis of the 70s required an intervention from below, but also from above, in determining the composition of production. It was not just an issue of wages, not just an issue of ownership, public ownership. The point was the capacity to control the composition of output, any kind of goods and services that workers then get, etc. Theoretically, a point that is linked to this, but I have not the time to go into the connection, the point was that we were not able to theorize money and finance properly. When I say we, I refer to the Marxists like Claudio Napoleoni, with whom I worked, the neo-Ricardians of any kind, Garignani, Pasinetti, etc. The post-Keynesians, who actually had just a view of money relevant in crisis as a store of value. The Cambridge Keynesians, like Robinson, Kaldor, Kaleski, were great on distribution, but underdeveloped from the point of view of money, except a couple of chapters of John Robinson. So, since I did I wrap up. So, I thought that it was necessary to develop the discussion studying finance and linking it to the dynamics of labor. So I would say, and I close on this, that in the so-called heterodox arena, there are two strands. Those who insist on demand and distribution, which are great problems, but those who prefer to start, like me, from money and production. So this is relevant theoretically, but is relevant nowadays to understand, think of the 2007-2008 crisis and so on.
Thank you. Nico.
So the point is I have a lot of thoughts I'd like to relay, and I think it will take about an hour. So I'll try to stick in 3-4 points here. The first one, I don't have an answer to that. I have a quasi-answer. Unfortunately, the way we've been trained, indoctrinated, educated, organized, mobilized until this moment is filtered, and I could even say, infected by what people like Gramsci would call the dominant hegemony, the dominant ideology of the socio-historical formation we live in. So we inherit a lot of fallacies from what you can call orthodox or vulgar or whatever economics. I think that actually this divide between micro and macro falls into this category. I actually use them a lot of time. We all use them a lot of time, maybe just for semantics, because that's exactly what people understand. But it's something that we should be very confident about breaking if we want to reconstruct Marx, or not just Marx, a generally non-neoclassical, non-orthodox tradition, or traditions, I don't know. There are certain fallacies that we have inherited and we should break away from. Another thing is, we have a certain way to backread not only Marx but a lot of people. Even people who are more historically closer to us than Marx, like Keynes or Schumpeter or Straffa, we kind of backread them in a way that we shouldn't. allow me to be a bit more pedantic here, and I do that with my students. Marx talks about laws and tendencies, and I think that was a way that people phrased these things at the time. They were a bit Newtonian in their mind setting, but they were also quite careful about it. Now we know that according to the law of gravity, this should be falling down to the center of the earth, and it's not. It's not. Marx has a name for that. Tendency and counter-tendency. And I'd like to praise a former work of Deepankar actually here. We need to see things in their totality. There was a work on the falling rate of profit where you try to integrate the counter-tendencies in it. I think this is an incomplete project, and we need to go back and again and again and again into it. We need to realize that what Marx is actually trying to do is not tells us, oh, you know, in 2055, this is going to happen. No, he's trying to give us an as clear as possible picture of what lies exactly inside the onion and how difficult it is to find it. And the way he does it is by a series of abstractions and concretizations. I'd like to say a few more things maybe. No, I'll leave it here. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Okay, Deepankar?
Thank you. So I also have a couple of comments. So I would start by reiterating a point that Riccardo made. I think it is key. It is there in volumes of capital. So there are two questions. One is how is capital produced? And second, how capital produces. I think the two are linked. But my reading is that Marx developed the labor theory of value to answer the first question, how is capital produced? Exploitation of labor, generation of surplus. The other question, which is how capital produces, leads to a lot of questions which I would consider to be macro. And while mainstream economics does fetishize this distinction, I think there is a point and there is a usefulness. So micro is a study of individual economic actors, and macro is a study of the system dynamics. It is not possible often to go from the former to the latter, which mainstream economics does. So there are certain logics and tendencies that operate at the system level, which you cannot just get by aggregating units. So the two sets of questions are different. They have to be addressed, and that's why I think separating macro and micro is important. So now going back to the question about how capital produces, I think that is the domain of macroeconomics, and while post-Keynesian and institutionalists have done a lot of work, I think the Marxist tradition has made a lot of contribution. And I find myself increasingly drawn to that tradition and to analyze, to present the ideas and questions of both the structure and long-run dynamics and the short-run fluctuations. So here I'm talking about the tendencies for growth, the importance of technical change, the fluctuations and the crisis tendencies. And a way in which I organize my thinking goes back to a very important idea that I take from Anwar's work. So there are two fundamental classes in capitalism, and their interactions govern the whole system dynamics. The competition between the capitalists within the capitalist class leads to technical change, which generates surplus, and then the struggle between capitalists and workers leads to the distribution of that surplus. So I think if we have a theory to look at these two aspects, we have a very good way to understand the long-run and short-run dynamics of capitalism. And I think the Marxist tradition produces and gives us a way to think of this. There is a lot of work done by Anwar, Duncan Foley, and a lot of others. I think we need to bring that forward. And one important thing that we need to do is to be more attuned to empirical analysis, to test those theories,
That is the way in which we can explain what is going on in contemporary capitalism. And what Kostas yesterday said very, very nicely, I think we need to give a simple but not a too simplified framework to militants and activists to understand the macro dynamics, and that is where I think a lot of work needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, to me, the relevance of relying on Marxian economics, I'm trying to have like 3 points which kind of follows my presentation. I think the first one is definitely the issue of value. Sadly, in economics, as I mentioned very quickly, value, the understanding of value is within the market. So it's the question of utility. If it has utility, it has value. Has value, has utility. It keeps going around. And I think we need to go back within economics at the discussion of value, what value it is, within the political economy of today. So if you look at the economy today, especially in developed economies, but also in developing economies, we see the issue of the share of labor and capital, how the share of labor is decreasing and the share of capital is increasing. We see the issue of inequality. So to me, is the question: have we really solved the issue of distribution of where profit comes from? And I don't think we have. And I think the Marxian economics, at least, is kind of giving us some direction of how to understand that. So I think understanding value in a context of today is key for me, and I rely a lot on Marx to trying to do that. The second point has been mentioned here several times, is to go against this idea of micro-foundation. So the micro-foundation, which is the only game in town today in economics, to a point that in the US especially, there is this idea that we don't need the macroeconomics anymore because everything is micro, right? And I think there is a question for us to challenge there, because if you're relying on micro foundations, you're really seeing the economy just from the perspective of the individual's choice. It's just about that, and economics become about understanding these choices and the constraint of these choices. And there's much more to that, right? I think, to me, a macro, and I don't think it's just macro or micro. I think, you have to have both, but I think the issue, the macro perspective, especially within Marxian economics, it gives us a much more sense of reality, which was trying to show with the John Robinson discussion. And I think we need to keep pursuing that, to have a very strong analysis of our reality. And the last point is the issue of finance and the MM prime. And I think nowadays, it's very easy to talk to the generation that's coming, and they do believe that we can just invest in financial things to get your money. I don't know how it's here in the US, but I found out that in Brazil there's an app now, literally an app, that you get 10 reals and just invest in a portfolio, and just automatically. And I feel like, wow, the idea that money can generates money, I think something we still have to keep challenging if that's the case. What has happened? Where is this wealth and surplus created? Where is that coming from? Does money really come from trees, or can you just, what's happening? So I think there's a question of understanding finance, this expansion of finance and the proliferation of financial assets in our economy, and the link with value that is still very much pertinent. I like Michael Perelman's point, sorry, I'm going to have to go back to fictitious capital, that fictitious capital is this nexus that links production and crisis, right? And I think there is a lot of work to be done that, which include looking at what is the largest, let's say, amount of financial capital in economy, which is actually government bonds, which actually that implies that the state is very much active in our economy in a very different way that is not also understood or within the Marxism. Government bonds is a part of the Marxism that is very much influenced by the Keynesian economics. So I think there is also a space within the Marxian framework to discuss fictitious capital and government bonds from a more radical perspective, and therefore criticizing the state from a different perspective. Yeah.
And let's open it up to everyone here. And please introduce yourselves. Yeah. Where is the mic?
Yes, I would like to point out something that hasn't really been talked
Please
about.
introduce yourself.
My name is Roberto Mendoza. I've been involved in the movement since 1969, starting with the Alcatraz, and I've continued, and I've learned a few things. I used to be a Marxist-Leninist, like some of these people, but I evolved out of that, thank goodness, for very good reasons. And I'd like to just tell you folks something that hasn't been said. This is from Samir Amin. He said, the principle of endless accumulation that defines capitalism is synonymous with exponential growth, and this, like cancer, ends in death. And I would like to remind you that Guattari and Deleuze, two French thinkers, psychoanalyzed the capitalist system, and they found that it was psychotic. Because it is. And one of the things that lets you know that someone or something is psychotic is lack of empathy. Does the capitalist system care about the 500,000 people living on homelessness on the streets of this country? Hell no.
Then in the end, come back to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, should we?
We'll take a bunch of questions and then.
Yes, there's a question here. Oh, okay, there's sorry, after.
There's a question here. So I'm reading it. Paulo has lost his voice. So, in deference. So, Paulo dos Santos, along with a few other New School colleagues, had an extremely frustrating discussion with Adam Tooze. He says Marxism is effectively pointless and that even the concept of capitalism gets in the way of clarity. He prefers terms like polycrisis and a stance that all but explicitly rejects analytical synthesis. If you had to argue against him in favor of the unique analytical usefulness of Marxism, what would be the first point you'd make? Why is Marxism indispensable? Okay. Ushal, yes.
This might be a question directly to Dr. I'm sorry, my name is Xavier Doolittle. This may be directly to Dr. Alves, because I know this is your work, but if anyone else wants to respond as well. Something that Ingrid had mentioned was your work on trying to take away from Eurocentrism within the tradition, thinking about the political economy of Marx specifically. Do you have references to scholars and works outside of the European Center that would add to that and that we can use in that analysis of Marx's political economy? Thank you.
Ramaa, so you get last one, then we do another round anyway.
Good morning, and thank you for traveling to Tulsa to bless us with your incredible knowledge. I'm an engineer, but I've also been raised as a capitalist, and obviously with the turmoil that we have going on right now, I've worked in manufacturing for 30 years, so I am very, very close to the labor, and I have had experience with companies that do share the profit with the employees who are then able to purchase and make the capital improvements with their own families and lives. And so I know we're studying on the very other liberal side of this and trying to have discourse on the differences between capitalism and socialism and Marxism. Is there a happy medium to combine all of the blessings and positives of each of these political theories into a brand new economic way forward? In First Robotics, we teach the students cooperation. So it's both the ability to compete and the ability to assist. And we try to teach them that by being the best in their own abilities, as well as helping their neighbor and their competitors be their best, that we reach true equilibrium.
I'll allow the panelists now to respond. We can go start with Deepankar and come down. Yeah.
Thank you. I think these are very important questions to consider. So let me answer some of these questions. First, about Eurocentrism, that is an important point. In fact, I had wanted to mention that. So one of the limitations of Marxian economics, I think, is that mostly it is focused on a closed capitalist economy, and the picture in mind is really an advanced capitalist economy. So one thing that we need to do is to take that model to the international economy, where there is interaction between capitalist economies and other structures of economies which are not yet fully capitalist, and look at power relations. The question of imperialism is very important to integrate back there. And the second aspect is to try to extend the capitalist, the Marxist framework to understand the structure and dynamics of developing economies. And here there is work of a structural macroeconomist and thinkers from the global south that we can draw on. There is a rich tradition, and we should draw on that. So that's about Eurocentrism. I think we need to move beyond. And there is already some work there. To go back to Anwar's question about capital stock, so there are two separate sets of questions where the capital stock plays an important role. One is the calculation of the price of production, and another is a big literature which has just calculated the rate of profit to see how it is doing. It is falling or going up, and then relate it to crisis tendencies. Now, the second set of literature typically just uses the estimates of capital stock produced by the statistical agencies. For the US, it is the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they have a series of capital stock, both replacement cost and historical cost, and that is typically used. But I think Anwar was referring to the price of production, and one thing that we encountered when we did this work is that it was not clear to us how lot of the existing work had constructed the capital stock matrix, and it is an important question, and we have constructed it from the depreciation data that is published by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and we explain our methods, and we have made our data and method publicly available on the website. We hope that others will read it and tell us if they have done it differently, if that is really the source of the difference that we are getting. I am not able to completely pin it down, but I think that's an important question. To go back to Adam Tooze's question, I mean, capitalism is the key, and it is not a new thing for a thinker to say, oh, don't think about capitalism, there is other things. That has always been the case. Many thinkers don't want to think about capitalism. I think what the Marxian tradition provides is a focus on the two fundamental classes whose interactions and interaction within them govern the system dynamics. So as I said, going back to Anwar's work, capitalist competition leads to technical change, class struggle leads to the distribution of the fruits of technical change. I think in a very pithy way, those are the two kind of poles that determine system dynamics, and I don't think there is any other framework available which can provide such a powerful way to understand capitalist dynamics. And finally, the last question about cooperatives. I think that's a very important question. What would be the institutional setup? Now, I think we need to think about that at two different levels. One is the current setup. What can we do today to make the institutional setup work better for workers? And there, worker-managed firms, cooperatives are certainly a step in the right direction. But that by itself will not help us understand the systemic change that is necessary to have a system where all workers are able to have rights and the system not being driven by the exploitation. So that second question requires systemic thinking, and I don't think it is possible to avoid the question of power, state power, to think of those larger issues which in this tradition is broadly discussed under the question of revolution. So I think there are two separate levels at which that question need to be discussed. Thank you.
Okay, lots of interesting questions, and I'd like not to start with Adam Tooze, because I think this is a very good focus and towards the end of it. I'll start with a very generic comment about cooperation. How did you call it? Cooperation. I haven't heard the word before, it's interesting. But cooperation and mutual aid is something that we know it predates human societies. And stepping a bit away from Marxism, I think that the best anarchist book is Mutual Aid by Piotr Kropotkin, because he actually gives us the story that we have been systems, we have been societies, we have been social beings, political beings, as Aristotle puts it, much before we were humans. What capitalism, and particularly the more recent forms of capitalism does, the recent political and economic forms of capitalism does, I'm talking about Thatcher, I'm talking about Reagan, I'm talking about these things, is forget you're a society. Forget that you have social ties with other people. You're individuals. And then you're coming to methodological individualism, really corrupting your own life, not just your theories, your life. And this is something that we have to fight for. I don't know how, I don't want to come up with a vision and say, here it is. I don't think I can. But I know that this is the problem, and that's where one should start to find a solution, that we have not always lived this way as societies. Grounding the students in their realities, that was an interesting question, actually. And it made me think of Howard Zinn's play Marx in Soho, where he says that when he wrote the Communist Manifesto and then when he wrote The Capital, at least that's Howard Zinn's interpretation of Marx's life, his wife came to him and said, "Why do you start this book, meaning Capital, this way, and don't you start it like the very nice militant outcry to the people as you started the Communist Manifesto?" There's a good reason for that, and this will take us back to Adam Tooze eventually. But at the same time that Marx wrote Capital, he also wrote a pamphlet, actually it was a series of talks, given to workers of the First International, if I remember correctly, the Wages, Prices, and Profits, where he tries to take his theory from whatever royal cloud of abstraction and bring it down, not bring it down exactly, not, spoil the science for whomever, but tries to ground it exactly to the realities of the workers. And I think that for many years, I'm thinking the European social democratic parties and their relation to the unions, this was quite obvious to many workers. And that's again something that we have to regain, and maybe how Marxists have done it in the past can help us, maybe. Now, how Marx started Capital, and how does this ties with Adam Tooze's question about why is Marx's crucial, and why do we or don't we need this analytical synthesis? I'll go a bit before the capital-labor discrepancy that Deepankar quite rightly put on the plate here. Marx starts in pretty much the way Valra does, talking about the commodity. That's how Capital starts. Why? Why don't we talk about people? Actually, all modern neoclassical economics start from the people. We have individuals, we have their utilities, we have their behaviors. That's the fundamental block of analysis. No, commodity is the fundamental block of analysis, and not just because it's commodity that defines commodity production and capitalism, but because commodification, not just of this, but commodification of our social ties, of our values, of beauty and love and sexuality and fear and hate and all of this, this is the fundamental form of capitalism. Capitalism is marketizing all forms of social life to the point that it commodifies human bodies, commodifies human reactions. Yeah, that's it. It's money. So if someone asks me why Marxism is crucial, is exactly this point. Sartre has put it quite interestingly, so long that capitalism hasn't stopped, the causes that capitalism hasn't stopped, Marxism is still relevant, exactly for this reason. And as a Greek journalist used to say, something is not correct because Marx said it. Marx said something because it's correct. Causality being reversed.
Thank you. No, just a quick shout out to Mendonça. I agree. We have to change our values and be very aware of the capitalist value that's already ingrained in our minds. So I totally agree with you, and I hope you see all of us here doing this. On one overshake question, this is definitely not a question for me, but I want just to mention that I find it quite puzzling this discussion of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and so on within Marxism. It takes us to how we measure things, and I think the question of profit stock is still one that hasn't been solved. I just want to highlight that I think what makes sometimes mainstream economics so strong is that they have a kind of, they agree in a core, and then they are able to move forward. And sometimes I would like to see that in Marxism, especially when it comes to the profit stocks and how we calculate capital, how we estimate capital stock. I know Anwar himself has this fantastic discussion with the Humbug, whatever you pronounce, production function, and I think to me, this is another aspect. It takes me to John Robinson and so on, how we keep expanding and scrutinizing this concept of just capital, how we measure how it is, to be able to actually create this core which as a discipline and as, you know, a community you can move forward. But yeah, it's just like a very general comment. That's definitely not, I know it's not a question for me. On the question of language, Brian, your point, I also struggle to deal with my students within economics on how, because I'm getting students now where I'm working where they don't have a background in economics, but they do have the thirsty of kind of, I want to learn more about what's happening, especially because economics in the last 30 years has really kind of invaded our lives in so many ways. It's like they assume that you should be literated in economics, and the way economics is taught, or even like in UK in the sixth form, is a kind of economics that I don't think you make us clear of what's happening. I don't know the tools of how to do this, but I'm kind of positive that actually the students can take much more than we think they can. I'm currently running this module for students that are not economists on rethinking capitalism, and I decided to go a little bit hardcore in the first half and bring in people like, just invite Anwar, I brought Jairus Banaji. I really want them to get into this hardcore discussion of what capitalism is, and they're loving it. They said they don't understand half of it, but everything makes sense, and they're reading a lot. So I think as an educator, I can't see in academia that a research should be separate from teaching. I think these two things come together. So as a researcher and a teacher in academia, I think this is our role to kind of keep playing with the tools we have to educate these students. The 2 points on Adam tools, and then it links with the Eurocentric aspect. I mean, I'm not going to get into this poly crisis because probably is on YouTube and I don't want to compromise myself. But I just can't understand this concept. I think, and I join a little bit with the Eurocentrism. I have so many criticism to that concept, but one is definitely the Eurocentric perspective. And a poly crisis for who? You know, like there are so many countries in the global south that are constantly in many different crises and war and so on for such a long time. It's the same thing with the golden period after the Second World War. You know, look what was happening in the global south in that period, but most of the literature within Marxism, within heterodoxy, portrayed this period as like, oh my gosh, the global economy was growing, and then you look in the global south, what was happening. It's the same with the poly crisis. I think is kind of narrowed. This is just like one point, the way you can criticize it, but I find kind of is arrogant when academics such as Tuzi can say that Marxism is useless. I think any person that has spent a lot of time with knowledge should get humble that everything can teach us something. One thing, for example, one thing that it comes from John Robinson that when she was engaging with Marx in her time, no one could understand that. She was a rather renowned economist, and you see the letters she exchanged with friends in Cambridge, and they're saying, why you're doing this? Why are you reading Marx? You know, so because I want to know more, because I want to investigate reality, I want to know what's happening. So to me, I think we should be open. So I find it like a very arrogant take, especially by academics. So this is all, I think, as what we're doing here, you can see there are differences between us, but I think what we're trying to do is to at least have, I think the agreement that we have here with many Marxists in the room is that we're trying to have a more accurate understanding of reality. And as John Robinson said in 1942, and I agree, Marx has that. We have to refine a lot, to have to do the empirical work, but Marx has that. So I think this is what I wanted to say. And the final point on Eurocentrism, I think there are two different things. One is the theory, right? I think Eurocentrism is, to me, to challenge Eurocentrism, and that's a work that I'm doing with Ingrid, is not just by myself, is your standpoint, right? How you're looking at economy. And if your standpoint is not the one that bind to this capitalism emerging in Europe and your endogenous way, and then all the rest of the world had to follow this. You get many scholars from the global south that challenge this kind of linear development of capitalism. So this theoretical perspective does, I think is something that many economists were doing before. You get Celso Furtado, by the way, wasn't like a Marxist or whatever, but the entire structuralist structuralist school in Latin America, and the dependency school, what they're doing is they have a different standing point of looking at reality. And that is what Eurocentrism, challenge Eurocentrism is to have a different standing point that wasn't the European. And you get the heterodoxy. I'm not going to anticipate the book that's coming up with Ingrid, but you have one chapter on heterodoxy, which wasn't part of our original plan, because heterodox, they're rocking, they're not Eurocentric. And then when I started writing the book, I was like, Jesus, this is bad. Because, you get the Keynesians, for example, the conception of nation is already, has to be challenged. You get within the heterodoxy how they see the labor market, when labor market informalization is actually the rule, not the exception. So there is a theoretical standpoint which you have to be challenged. And it doesn't mean you have to be based in the global south. I think one example I give my students, the Chicago boys, right? They are Chileans, but they are educated with this Eurocentric view of the economy. So it's not this liberal diversity. Let's get economists from the global south and discuss. No, because if they have the standing point from what capitalism is, so it changes nothing. And the second point is the authors, how the space that the heterodox community does for authors from the global south, which actually it was made me and Ingrid and other friends to start to discussing that as someone who comes from Brazil and was doing my PhD at SOAS. There was no space for global south scholars. Now everybody puts the word global south there. But it wasn't. 2012, 2011, I remember mentioning Maria Conceição Tavares. Everybody, yeah, who is that? Oh, but this is but no one I haven't read her. Is she good? And now, of course, that's the annoying part of still being in the UK, because you see the opportunistic way that everybody's talking about global south with global scholars. So there is a question of erasing global scholar. There is the translation, the language. Some people can't read in Portuguese and Spanish. But I think there is a lot of erasure, and that's another point, how we give space for these authors. And I have a lot of recommendations, if you want. In my field, political finance, you have, for example, Leda Paulani, who is brilliant. You have Braga. The entire school of Unicamp are doing a fantastic work on that. But, yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Riccardo.
Few points on 2-3 questions. On Eurocentrism, it's a big issue. I can discuss that. I just want to advance 2 points of cautions. It is not like if there is a Eurocentric reality and outside all the rest. So, for example, one thing which is clear, at least since 40, 50 years ago, is that the North entered the South and the South entered the North. So this is a complication. Second, I see that people want to be Marxist. To be Marxist, I think you can't cancel completely Eurocentrism from Marx. You can do that, but that is another thing altogether. Before going on, let me say that I do not feel myself as a Marxist since the early 80s. I define myself as a Marxian. I hope it has been clear. I could say also I am a Schumpeterian, a structuralist Keynesian, but the focus is on a certain Marx, and I think it was clear which one. Monetary value theory of labor as theory of impersonal domination and exploitation and money capital. But this leads to the suggestion that you had to study all the other, I take pain to quote this and that, etc. Not only because I was at the center of heterodox economist. Marx was asked to do from the daughters, I think, was called the Proust Questionnaire. And he chose as a motto, taken from Descartes, doubt everything, which means, of course, doubt also yourself. And he was the guy who said, je ne suis pas Marxiste. About tools. Somebody told me, I think Gary Dimsky, that with a group of Crotty, they met Minsky, and they were disappointed at one point. Why there was not a big labor, why were not more the reference to Marx. The same can be said about tools. I'm not interested that tools is interested in Marx. I am interested in tools because he says things that can be related to what I think it's interesting now. Of course, my reference to tools is first of all to the tools of the book Crushed, partially the one on nature. Polycrisis is one of the people to read, but it is too generic, it's not really my tools. So if people are interested, I did a review article on Crushed by tools. Let me close with just two general points that I think are relevant also with the question. First, in Marx, I think one should distinguish criticism and critique. It is the only time in which you may listen to me, listen me saying that English is better than Italian. Because in Italian we have only one word, critica. But the concept for me, relevant for Marx, are two, criticism and critique. They are not the same. Criticism is picking up the error of the opponent theory. Critique is what Marx, to say one author just, what he did with Riccardo. He respected Riccardo, he was a scientist, you learn from him, you see the kernel of truth in what he said, and then you sublate, is the Hegelian term, conserve and overwhelm. This does not lead, with all the people that I named, to a pluralist position. Pluralist is again a bad word. It's not a good word. It is a bad word. And the search for a common ground among heterodox is delusional. You need to understand that economic theory, social theory is plural. That's another thing altogether. Pluralism, oh, we are equal, we want to be respected by the mainstream, etc. Take some four names: Marx, Schumpeter, Keynes, and Zraffa. Wait, they're pluralists? No. Marx proposed a new orthodoxy and, of course, included in himself Riccardo as a partial truth. Schumpeter did the same more or less with Barras. Keynes did the same with Marshall. And Zraffa destroyed the other theory, but also to construct something else. I don't know where we will go. My Marxian approach is because those things, as I said, exploitation, are there, and money capital, which allows me to have a relationship with all others, I think should be related to that kind of exploitation. I am happy to include everything from any social scientist who is so smart and intriguing as tools.
I have to say something about the delusional.
Oh, we are out of time.
No, but you want the fight? Clara wants the fight. Perfect.
Last word to Carolina.
As long as I've got to go ahead.
I have two things to say about that. Of course, there are differences, and although I was focused on the empirical aspect, but the thing is, love it, Zraffa, whatever, but we have to contextualize how is knowledge produced now, the power of mainstream, the power of journals, the power of subfiles, how we produce knowledge. And the question is, this pluralism, which is interesting and is important, also needs to be strategic, right? Because which goes to how we're going to teach our students. So there is one thing that is, I'm not asking for everyone to be homogeneous. Of course, there's difference that's important, but what's the strategy for heterodox economists to win the debate at the battle of ideas? Is to keep scrutinizing how we measure capital, scrutinizing the parameters of an econometric model, or how the profit is measured with tax or not, or with net. The point is, this is fine, but how we get together, and there is at the knowledge level, there is a big enemy there, which is the mainstream economics. How we strategically engage with them to win the debate. That's it. And you can't say anything else.
Yes, the last one was for Carolina. Thank you so much. So now we have a coffee break of 15 minutes. The coffee break is downstairs on the second floor. I believe there's steps to go down if you don't want to take the elevator. And there's also a really nice terrace that you can check out with the view of Tulsa just outside here if you want to take a breath of fresh air. We see each other soon. Thank you. This was awesome. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you, Ramaa. Thank you.